Welcome to the Rich with Purpose podcast, the finance podcast that's about more than just money. I'm your host, Taborjan Rasaya, financial advisor to hundreds of successful clients over the years. In each episode of this show, I speak with other experts in the complex world of money and finance, and together we discuss how you can ensure you make smart decisions with your money. Even more importantly, how to connect those decisions with your values and your purpose in order to achieve everything that is most important to you. Please note that everything we discuss is not personal advice, but general in nature. For the full disclaimer, please visit our website, richwithpurpose.com.au, where you can also register your details to get access to all our free resources. And please hit subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. In today's episode, I speak to Clayton Daniel. Clayton is the Managing Director of XY Advisor, a social media platform dedicated to driving the positive evolution of financial advice. What's unique about Clayton is that as the host of the XY podcast, he has spoken to subject matter experts from around the world to uncover the principles, strategies, and concepts that top advisors are using in their businesses. I've had the pleasure of being a guest of Clayton's on the XY podcast twice now, so it's nice to be on the other side of the mic. In this episode, we discuss the evolution of financial advice from its beginnings in life insurance sales to the current move to becoming a true profession. Clayton shares his learnings from the hundreds of advisors he has interviewed. We also talk about the many different types of financial advisors with varying service offerings, the different fee structures that exist, and the criteria that people should consider when looking for an advisor. And make sure you listen to the end where Clayton tells us about his own purpose and how he is going about achieving it. So if you're interested in learning more about the evolution of financial advice, you will enjoy this episode of the Rich with Purpose podcast. G'day, Clayton. Good to see you and have you on the Rich with Purpose podcast. Welcome.
Mate, thanks for having me.
I really wanted to talk to you, Clayton, about the evolution of financial advice. I think you're perfectly placed to do it given your background and the number of people that you talk to, not just in Australia, but all around the world about financial advice. And you've got such a good understanding of where advice came from and the transition and the evolution that it's gone through recently. But before we get into that discussion, can you just give us a quick snapshot of your journey and how you got into and then now out of advice into your current role?
Yeah, certainly. I did an accounting degree. I worked as a tax accountant for a couple of years. Interestingly, my first day on the job was, here's an office, here's your table, start seeing clients. No introduction to anything. And then there they were, just one after the other as a tax accountant. And it's a very sort of simple role. And then over time, it became more complex. And then I started sort of seeing the same clients year after year after year. And then I was doing a little bit of planning by, I guess, the last year that I was in tax that would help them get a lower tax return. But the planning involved was really limited to a 12-month period. Realistically, it was like, well, if you do this kind of thing and, yada, yada, yada. Around this time, I started working in the same office as some financial planners, and they introduced me to what financial planning was, and I was blown away. So then I was able to take sort of that interaction, that face-to-face, that relationship style, which I'd become accustomed to. But now all of a sudden I could extend the level of planning that was involved beyond 12 months, but rather over the course of a life. And that was very, very attractive. So I swapped over into financial planning. After a few more years of working in financial planning, I then started my own company, and I had that for a handful of years. And during that time, I went from not really knowing what the extent of what financial planning was. And then a handful of years later, just as I exited financial planning, I had changed my service entirely. in fact, it sort of blossomed into this like lifestyle and financial management framework. Since that time, I sold that company to move across into, I'm now MD of XY Advisor, which is a peer-to-peer professional development online community. And the exposure I've now had since leaving financial advice has probably made me think I could have even done things a lot better if I had the chance to even start again, which sometimes I kind of wish I would. So yes.
So Clayton, you moved from giving advice, and then you got out of advice. Why did you get out of advice in the first place?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And there was a combination of a couple of things, but it was almost along the lines of I'd done so much work, effort, study. I tried so hard to get to a stage where I felt like I was living in my purpose, which I guess as a financial planner is to make financial concepts simple, right? So what I like to do, if I consider the purpose of my life, it is to make things simple for people so that they make better decisions. And then working in financial advice, it was kind of like, if I can help people make financial decisions that are better because they understand the concepts, then they'll get better outcomes. And I did all of these hard yards to get to a stage where I was limited with how many people I could help, just purely because I'm one person, and you can really look after maybe 100, maybe 150 people. And I thought, I wish I could get more people to understand the journey that I had. And if anything, perhaps I can help other advisors, well, maybe not personally, but facilitate an environment where advisors can help each other. And then if that drives the positive evolution of financial advice, then thousands and millions of people get access to better quality of advice. And that, I guess it was the idea that I want people to have great financial outcomes and to get great financial advice. There's a chance I can help do that across the world rather than just to a group of 100 and 150 people.
Yeah, that's really good. And that really, really resonates with me. As an advisor, we look after plenty of clients, but one of the reasons I started this podcast, is to share all the learnings and experience that I've gained over many years, but also share the learning and experience of people like yourself and others in the industry, and all the guests that we're having on this podcast with, hopefully hundreds and hopefully thousands of listeners over time, so that more and more people can benefit from our experiences.
Yeah.
Now that you've been talking to so many different advisors from all walks of life, what's your view of the financial advice industry? We've been through a lot so far, and we'll get into the history and the evolution, but you mentioned that in some ways you wish or you think it'd be great to be an advisor given everything that I've learned.
Yeah.
What does that tell you differently about the industry now than what you knew about the industry when you left as an advisor?
Yeah. So I guess it would have been around 2007 when I first was introduced, 2006, 2007, when I was introduced to financial planning. And there was, even at that stage, which is only sort of less than 15 years ago, there was really only one way it was kind of done. But, at least that was the limitation of the people that were introducing me to it. And there was a pretty set structure. This is how you get into financial planning, and this is how you earn revenue, and this is how you deliver advice. And it was kind of laid out in a very formulaic way. And that's since I'd say the last probably 5 years, I've seen that premise completely destroyed, and new people are coming to market with completely different ways of delivering advice, and I get to have conversations with people like you, and you've been doing this for far longer. So if I'd been exposed to the way that you deliver advice back from when you started your career, I might actually still be in advice that if I'd come through a different pathway.
Appreciate the very complimentary, Clayton. And yeah, I think you're right. I've been super fortunate that pretty much since the beginning of my career, I've been really fortunate that I worked with some of the best in the industry. The principles that I espouse now doesn't mean that they're correct, but when I first got into the industry for the last 15 years, we've operated on a no commission basis, on a virtually non-aligned basis, always thinking about clients first. And yes, things evolve and change, but everything I've learned is from other people. So you're absolutely right. It's being in the right environment, and whether you're fortunate enough to land in the right place and learn from those around you. Now, for the listeners, Clayton, financial advice is something that has a certain meaning depending on what you've experienced, and the listeners will have different views of what they think financial advice is. As you and I know, and you probably more so because you've talked to hundreds of advisors in your current capacity over the years, that there's so many different types of advice. But
Yes.
for consumers and for listeners, it's really hard to understand the differences and know what type of advice is right for them. There's so many different types of advice. It's not that one's better than the other. It's what's the right fit for different people. Before we get into those different types of advice, I think it's really useful to talk about where the industries come from, because that can help our listeners understand, the framework that advice sits in at the moment. So if we go back to the beginning of, life insurance sales, investment sales, where advisors were really employed by product providers to sell products, we've then gone through a journey of other things happening, Royal Commission, et cetera, to where we are today. Can you just tell our listeners from the advisor that you've spoken to, your understanding of that evolution?
Yeah, certainly. Definitely going back to the beginning, insurance was a pretty amazing concept that came out of, if I was to take a stab, I could be wrong here, but potentially it was a bunch of archbishops in Ireland or something like that. If you're going back to like the 1600s, and then this product of life insurance was a valuable product, especially in a time before, especially before the post-Keynesian economics and the world being flush with cash as it is now. Insurance was amazingly valuable because if your partner passed away, at least you were able to raise your children on something. And so that served a really important purpose in society, and hence it's been around for a long time, and it was being sold as a product just like a car. And so people go out and buy a car because they need to get from A to B. Well, insurance sort of just covered you in case something went wrong between A and B. And then from there, we at least here in Australia, mandatory superannuation begins, late 80s. And then the same people, or the same companies, I should say, that were already selling life insurance just said, hey, we can take on amounts of cash as well, and we can invest that. And so then you had agents who could sell two things. Hey, insurance here, but hey, if you don't die and you stick around, here's some money at retirement if you put money in this thing. And so it was now you had a car and a motorbike, but it was realistically they were products. And when we say products, it was entirely designed to solve a problem, and the person selling it was there to sell a particular product. It didn't matter if the person needed a car or a motorbike, and it didn't matter if someone needed a Toyota or a Ford, or at least they wanted a Toyota or a Ford. It was, I'm a Ford salesman, here's your car. That's changed, and in a large way. So, there was a bunch of, I'd say, and I'm sure you agree to this entirely, there was a bunch of really bad things that happened because of that remuneration model. And so
the remuneration model you're talking about, where advisors are effectively paid to sell products.
Yeah.
That's what you mean?
Yeah, correct. I mean, Storm Financial, that's probably the most well-known publicly. It cost clients billions of dollars with a B, an enormous amount of money. And that was entirely based on the fact that those planners, the business model that the company operated in was sell a product, get paid commission, essentially. That created the need in this country for a bunch of changes. And there's multiple tranches of those changes that have been rolled out over about the last decade. And we're on the other side of it. Financial planning now looks, smells, tastes, touches. It's a different thing, mandated by the government. But probably most people don't realize that yet. Yeah.
Is it? There's still different ownership structures in terms of advice businesses. There's still, and they definitely serve a purpose, but there's still a lot of advisors that are employed by businesses that have their own products, and that's allowed to continue under the current rules. And as I said, it serves a purpose.
Yes.
Where do you see that fitting in with everything?
It just muddies the water in terms of the potential for conflict. While the rules are pretty clear in that technically no conflict should exist, it unfortunately muddies the waters. And these days, advisors are not remunerated, even if they are an advisor to a product provider. Then it's impossible to be remunerated via that channel in a more advantageous way. With that said, if your entire professional experience is limited to a particular ecosystem, while there is opportunity to look outside of it, it does make it potentially a little bit more difficult than if you are operating within a company that has what used to be formerly known as an independent license, but now is known as a private license.
So we've moved through that very sales-centric model into, a royal commission that's, shaken a lot of things up. I certainly think that, unfortunately, it has led to some really high regulation. And when I say unfortunately, it's made the job of giving advice that much more difficult. And there certainly are some casualties and some really good advisors that, won't be able to meet the standards necessary moving forward. But hopefully as a whole, it will mean that consumers, after a period of time, and I think the date is 2026, from 2026, consumers will know that every advisor they talk to has had to meet a certain level of standards. Of course, as I said, there are going to be some advisors I know some of the best advisors who are not going to meet those standards, unfortunately, and they've got some really difficult decisions to make as to whether they remain in the industry or not. But I think consumers will have a lot more confidence.
Yeah.
There's also different ways that advice is given as well. And again, you've talked to so many different advisors out there. A lot of advisors are focused on product. So even though there's not the sales culture, the offer that they have to help clients is to find them a good investment product, a good superannuation product, a good insurance product. And some advisors, if we use industry super funds, for example, which have a really important place in our ecosystem, the advisors that work there, they're limited to what they can give advice on.
Yeah.
And that's again very appropriate. So they service the members of the fund and they can advise on issues specifically associated with that fund, but they can't recommend other products. So it's more advice just related to that particular fund. Some advisors give advice purely on Australian equities. So a stockbroker is a good example of that. A mortgage broker is a good example of a debt advisor, if you like, a life insurance advisor. So, you know, there's different types of advisors and they all have an important role to play. We're now seeing more advisors giving advice focused on client goals and clients achieving those goals. And even more than that, in line with the concepts we talk about in this podcast, people seeking advice with life purpose in mind and values in mind. So can you talk a little bit about your experience talking to different types of advisors that do different things and how you see all of that play out?
Yeah, certainly. Well, the word advice, I think, is very difficult to get your head around because it's almost a great analogy would be to use the word flight. I'll explain two very different pathways to take a flight. One person can jump onto jetstar.com, purchase the cheapest ticket that's available, and arrive at their destination and think to themselves, I just needed this thing completed. I needed to get from A to B in this case. The other person, gets a concierge to purchase them a business class ticket. They go to the lounge at the airport. They're well looked after. They're pampered. It's a completely different experience. The price tags are a completely different experience, but we could both call them flights. And so if we were to say advice, it's such a surface level or financial planning. It's such a top line explanation for everything that goes on underneath. And because you have budget carriers, you have first class flights, you have every single piece of the value chain that exists in the aviation industry exists in financial planning, but we don't talk about it for whatever reason. I don't actually know why. In the medical field, it's very easy to separate a podiatrist from a physiotherapist to a surgeon, right? Like there are things that are easy to access and lower cost, and then there's more complicated things that require more complicated outcomes and typically more higher price tags. And so no one in their right mind would ever say a Jetstar flight from A to B is a bad idea, or a trip to a physiotherapist to get your shoulders massaged is not needed in society. Oh my God, that would ruin my life if NIB all of a sudden just refused to start discounting, the massages. So these things are super valuable in life. But it doesn't mean if I need surgery, like I've had hernia surgery, if I'd gone to my physiotherapist for that, then that would have been a huge problem, right? Because the person isn't qualified for that. They're not interested in doing that type of work. It's not what they deal with. But it's really clear in the medical field who you're dealing with and what problem people know. I have this problem. I go to this place. Financial advice is super, super different. There's a whole spectrum of it. It's completely diverse. To the point that no two advisors are the same, even within the same company, let alone different types of companies, let alone different types of licensing arrangements, let alone different types of services within the licensing arrangements, within the companies, within the individual. And so the level of it's because there's not confusion. It's probably just obscure. What a client needs to receive is the advice, the flight that someone needs to take is dependent upon what they want, what they value, what they're interested in, what their financial situation is. There's a number of things to look at that'll help an individual make that decision. However, getting access to that information is difficult. It is difficult. If I was to go to someone's website, I wouldn't be, even myself, having spoken to hundreds of advisors, I wouldn't know what I'm looking at. I wouldn't know. So it's impossible to know upfront unless you do a little bit of investigation, or in this case, hopefully the financial planner has a podcast, you can get to know them upfront. But in terms of the different types of advice that's out there, it's huge. It's very varied. Some is very transactional. Some's very low cost. I'm sure you can probably still get free insurance advice out there somewhere. Undoubtedly, that's probably a business model that still exists, and the person and the advisor would receive an insurance commission. But
you know what they say about free advice, right?
Well, here's the thing: if someone really needs life insurance, then it's available for them to get, and we wouldn't want to live in a world where the physiotherapist can't give the massage. But on the other end of the spectrum,
but it's not free, right?
Well, it's definitely not free. No, you're exactly right. It's never free. And so on the other end of the spectrum, you've got, extremely well thought out sort of journeys and discovering what it is that one wants out of life, and going through and articulating, short, medium, long-term, experiential and emotional and financial outcomes, and really exploring what the top or the most efficient life that someone can live, and hitting all those goals. That's a completely different service. But that, like yourself, are advisors out there that are delivering that service. And so it's hugely varied. And it does make it difficult for someone to know before going into the situation. And if I could do anything, it would be to create a magical service where you could put in what you were looking for, and it accurately found the advisor that delivered that service. But I just don't know how that's done.
It's a challenge, and again, for our listeners, that's one of the hard things. And we're trying to educate and share the knowledge to help people make those decisions a bit better. Your example with the doctors is a really interesting one. One of the examples I use is that I had a knee operation a number of years ago because I had I had to have an arthroscope done because of a torn meniscus in my knee, just from all the running I've done over the years. Now, what I did initially, I used to get physio and just try to manage the pain. Go and see the GP, get a bit of Panadol. You just fix that little issue. I think sometimes what we can do is, and if it didn't worry me about what the knee's going to be like long term, then I could have kept doing that. You just take the short term treatment, fix the pain. That's a bit like, in financial advice terms, that's a bit like looking for a solution to a little issue, whether it's what super fund do I use, or what should I invest in, right?
Yeah.
But because I wanted to make sure I do enjoy my running, I wanted to make sure that in 30 years' time, I can still, use my knee, play sport, do all the stuff that I love. I did go and take a more expensive journey to see a sports specialist, get the knee operation, cut my knee open, did the arthroscope, all that sort of stuff. And because the surgeon understood, and the surgeon asked me, how important is it to you? What do you want your knee for in the future?
Yeah.
You could keep doing what you're doing and you'll be fine. You're not going to die, right? You'll be fine. But do you want to be able to continue to do the things that you're doing physically at the moment, and how long for? And because of that, he recommended, I think you should do X, Y, and Z. So in financial planning terms, again, you can find a good super fund, you can find a good investment. But as we've said, for those, and that's totally suitable for some people and that's all they want.
Yeah.
But we're finding more and more that people are interested in achieving goals. People are interested in something bigger than just money, something more about what's important to them, what is their values, what is their purpose. And there are advisors that, focus on that level of advice, not because it's for everyone, but because it does add significant value and help people to go to that next level. So that was just one example that.
No, it's a really good example. And the fact that your doctor asked, what do you want to use your knee for? That's such a great question, right? Because if you're just paying a physiotherapist each week or each month, whatever it is, and they're solving that rudimentary issue, the pain, then the perceived goal is being reached, the perceived service is being delivered, but the underlying real, I guess, journey to solve what you're actually trying to solve wasn't getting looked at. Now, thankfully, you were in a sort of a financial position to be able to pursue that, which not everyone is, right? Not everyone is all the time is able to do that. But again, if you're in the financial position to do it and you're not getting your knee looked at properly, then that's crazy. I got a mate that's a doctor, and he trades stocks, right? And I just said, you shouldn't be doing any of this. I was like, you're a very important person. Go save lives. But you need a financial planner, and you need someone, and because he's so intellectual, he goes, oh, what's a financial planner going to do for me? Meanwhile, he has this amazing wife, right? He has this amazing wife that engages with money in a completely different way, right? She engages with money in a very typical way that most people engage with money, which is emotional, which is fear, greed, which is, I have worries, I have concerns. I'm excited. She's emotionally in charge, or like engaged with money. And I just said to him, look, even if you get nothing out of the conversation, right, which you kind of need to placate to doctors because they're very intelligent. I said, but your wife, she might not engage with money the same way, and maybe she would really appreciate engaging with money in a different fashion. And I think that kind of brought him around to the conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting where we deal with clients a lot or people a lot and talking about their money issues. We don't always know what we need either. And so, a good advisor, a good surgeon, a good interior designer will do a really good job of helping you understand what you're trying to achieve so that you can make a good decision. So that's really, thanks for that chat, Clayton. That's really good. We've talked about different types of advisors, and the key takeaway for me, it just reminds me that there's lots of different types of advisors. There's lots of different types of people. They all serve a purpose. The most important thing that our listeners should take away from this is that whoever you're going to deal with, make sure they're the right fit for you. Make sure that your advisor is going to help you achieve whatever it is that you want to get out of the relationship.
Yeah.
And by doing that, you'll have a better experience. So it's good to understand different types of advisors. Can you tell us a bit more about different fee structures? Because that's something that is really hard to understand as well. As you just mentioned before, you can get free advice, but as we know, nothing's free. But you can get really expensive advice. You can get, different ways that fees are structured. In my view, I don't think any of them are right or wrong. I just think that it's important to know how they operate and what they might mean. So again, just from your experience of talking to so many different advisors using different models, can you give our listeners a bit of a sense of the different things they should be aware of?
Yeah, certainly. So the traditional revenue model for an advisor was commission. So the client pays the product pays the advisor. Now
That's the free model that you talked about.
yeah, correct. So those commissions still do exist in life insurance and in investments, and superannuation no longer exist. They also still exist in mortgages. But a lot of financial advice now is moving to what's called fee for service, or in land beyond financial planning, pay and receive. So like the rest of the world. And so when you're paying a fee, there are a couple of different ways that's done. Most commonly, it's percentage based, or it's a flat fee. Sometimes it's a combination of both. So, for example, when I was an advisor, I had a flat fee and then a percentage based fee. I'm not sure what I would do these days. A lot of the times, I find advisors sometimes overcomplicate fees because they're trying to be as fair as possible, whereas simplicity is sometimes easier. And so a flat fee just says, look, I know how much work this is going to take me. I know the outcome that you're going to get. So that's how much it's going to cost. Other advisors say, you've got X amount of dollars in funds. I'm going to be taking on a risk by investing a lot of funds. So I'm going to take a percentage of what your total funds under management are. I tend to agree. There's pluses and minuses on all of those options. I don't particularly think out of what I just mentioned, there's ones that are inherently right and wrong. Potentially, you could argue conflicts, I guess, till the cows come home. But I guess the most simple one is probably hourly rates. But however, even at that stage, you could quite argue that. It's the taxi driver, right? Does the taxi driver take longer because he's getting paid? There's
conflicts in all of the models, isn't there? It's
there is not. Yeah. The moment you pull 5 cents out of your pocket and buy a lolly at the corner store, there's a conflict there. So there's nothing that has no conflict. I think, and the way that I sort of think about it is, judge how simple or complex your situation is, judge what outcome you want to achieve. And the more complicated your situation and the more that you want to achieve, you're probably going to pay more. It's kind of as simple if you get it down to that really basic concept.
That's a real good way to think about it. I like to, also think about it from a complexity perspective, and I think what you said then's spot on. What you're going to get out of it, or the other way to, and David Heinz, who will be a guest on our podcast as well. I worked with Dave for a long time, and he always says, cost is only an issue in the absence of value.
Yeah.
So I think the advisors that get it right really focus on making sure that if you're going to charge a fee, you better be damn sure that you're adding value for the client. And so if a client's got complex affairs and they want to achieve things that are really important to them, then achieving those things
totally
is valuable.
Massively.
So again, there's no right or wrong. And that's where sometimes people don't need too complicated advice. If they need really simple advice and they don't have not that they don't have aspirations, but they're pretty comfortable just figuring things out themselves, then they actually shouldn't be paying for a service that's delivering on something that they don't want or are going to benefit from. So that's really good, Clayton. Yeah. So in summary, there's lots of different ways that advisors charge. Again, for listeners, if you are thinking about getting advice, it's important that one, you know what the fee model is, that you want to have transparency.
Yes.
And secondly, you just want to make sure that it's aligned with what you want.
Yeah.
So, we've already, it's pretty complicated. It's pretty hard for consumers to pick an advisor or know what they're getting and why they're getting it.
Yes.
What's, are there some minimum things that our listeners should look out for? I know that there's been a whole lot of changes throughout the industry, going back the last 20 years, 30 years, there's been constant change and this move to professionalism of advice. We know that in 2026, that's a particular date. Of course, until that time, it's still a bit murky. So are there things that you can point to that people should look out for when trying to find an advisor that's right for them?
Yeah, goodness gracious, that's a hard question to answer. If I go through every single sort of element, whether it's aligned or if it's private, experienced or younger, degree or no degree, a lot of these things, I mean, ultimately, like, I feel like you've got a better chance, right, in terms of percentages. Yes, you've got a better chance of getting the outcome you want when the advisor is more experienced. When the advisor has a degree. There are basics. However, it's not to say that. What I would probably say mandatorily is, because the advisor is such an important person in someone's life, and it genuinely is. It's almost like having a guiding light for the outcomes of your family, right? Like, you can't really get a more important person in your life. And so I would say the mandatory thing is that what they stand for resonates with you, and that you can see, you connect with this person with what they stand for as an advisor. And so at its most basic, if you want something basic, then someone and an advisor does something basic and they stand for what you want, great. If they stand for something that advice is life-changing and that's what you value, then that is the kind of advisor that you should have. It's the resonate with, not just getting sold to, not just going to a meeting and them talking you around. I mean, like, ideally have some exposure to who the advisor is before you ever go into the office, before you ever meet them. Know what they stand for, know what they deliver, and then understand that's probably the level that you're going to engage with an advisor at its most pure. Is, what does that person stand for? What do I want, and how closely those two things align?
Yeah, that's really important, isn't it? I like to call it the right fit.
Yeah.
But you've articulated that really well. I know whenever we talk to people who are interested in getting advice, the one thing we say is, you need to figure out whether we're the right people for you. You need to like us. You need to have the right values that you're aligned with, as you said. And we also need to make sure that we're a good fit for you. And we've been doing it a long time, so we're in a pretty good position to know whether a client is going to be a good fit for us or not, or in fact whether one of our colleagues would be a better fit. And that's certainly really important. Okay, that's really helpful, Clayton, for people to understand the complexity of advice firstly, but then going on to some of the little tools, some of the little tips to what they might need to think about. Can you tell me a bit about this concept of goals-based advice? So that's not something that, I think most people out there and our listeners will understand that advisors can advise on superannuation, investments, insurance, debt
products.
management, cash
Yeah.
flow, the
Yeah.
products, and some of the strategies, how to save tax and stuff like that.
Yep.
Which, in my view, is really important. Like a good
Stick it to the
advisor
game.
has to be able to do it, right? Yeah, tickets to the game.
Yep.
The hygiene. It's the hygiene factor. It's just got to be done.
Yes.
But not many people are aware of the concept of, well, there's two things. One is goals-based advice, and the other one is purpose-driven advice, which are things that are not really talked about a lot. Can you tell us a bit more about goals-based advice? There's one of our colleagues in the industry, Fraser Jack, who, runs the Goals-Based Advice podcast, and he talks to a lot of advice about this concept. So can you tell us about what you've learnt from advisors that work in that space?
Yes, certainly. I think it probably stems from life planning or from a psychological angle rather than from a product delivery angle. So rather than, I'm an agent for a company, and I've in one jacket pocket, I've got superannuation. In the other jacket pocket, I've got insurance. And which one do you want? I sort of take the jacket off and say, what do you want out of life? Right. So it's a completely different conversation. And it takes, on behalf of the advisor, it takes a lot more work to learn to be able to adequately solve the answers to those problems. And that's a huge part of the story is, you can, in the media, it says you can become an advisor in a week or something like that, right? Get a qualification. Well, hopefully it's not that anymore, and it certainly won't be in the future, but there was a time where that was possible. And it's kind of like, well, no, that they got their little ticket to be able to sell the product, but I would never stick them in the same room as anyone I know, right? And it takes a long time and a lot of conscious effort to become the kind of advisor that is able to ask that question and then actually have a list of items that the client probably isn't even considering up their sleeve to be able to solve that problem, right? And so it comes at it. Goals-based advice is coming at an individual's life with the concept that whatever your problem is, or whatever it is, that's probably not the best way to put it, whatever the desires that you have for your life, as the premise of our conversation. And then we're going to do what we can using money and also, and using all these tools that we have, but also walk the individual through achieving those goals. And so it's not only a situation where someone's in a better financial position, they're actually in a better headspace, because an advisor is going to be asking questions that person probably hasn't even asked themselves, which is an amazing concept. And it's an amazing experience as an advisor to sit there and ask someone, what do you want? What's your purpose in life, for example, moving into purpose-driven advice. That question is the most intense question that you can ever ask someone. And an advisor isn't going to ask that question and then say, oh, that was interesting. Anyway, moving on. Here's my superannuation product up my sleeve. No, like if an advisor is going to ask that kind of question, then they need to have spent the time figuring out how they can help the client deliver on that, and how they can help the client actually take some practical steps to achieve that short, medium, and long term. And so it comes from that life planning sort of concept, that psychology concept, where it's that human first approach, and then using all of the financial tools, but also the experience of the advisor to help the individual achieve what it is that they want out of life, which is an amazing step up from traditional financial planning. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's certainly something that, again, I've learnt from, those before me, about being able to add value for people by having those purpose-based advice questions and discussions. And Yeah, again, it's not for everybody, but for some people, it fits right in with the theme of this podcast, Rich with Purpose. And you know, as you will know from the introduction episode and other episodes, our focus is on helping listeners understand whether or not they want to go down that path of really thinking about their purpose. Well, Clayton, as we finish up this podcast, this is a podcast about purpose. It's about how we can enrich our lives by focusing on our purpose and our values. And we know that different people have a different way of thinking about their purpose. No two people are the same.
Totally.
And not only that, one's purpose can change and evolve at different times in their life. So, you know, given your experience and the changes in your career and everything that you've seen and all the people you've spoken to in advice in particular, I'm really interested, based on your journey so far, how do you think about your purpose?
Yeah, that is such a big question. I'll never forget launching my financial planning company at 29 and I think 50 years old, just before I turned 30. And then for the first time, because I'd been so focused on getting to that stage for so long, once I'd hit it, I actually hit like a real bump in my momentum in life. And I'd arrived at the place that I'd worked so hard to achieve. And so I ended up hiring, you know, this mindset coach, right? And I'll never forget our first meeting. And the first meeting was, "Hi, Clayton. Nice to meet you. What's your purpose in life?" Like, it was just,
Wow,
bam, like a semi-trailer hit me. And I'd never been asked that question before. And it was so confronting. But I was pretty dedicated to answering the question. And yeah, so like, I think I may have even mentioned it earlier on the podcast, but it's to help people make better decisions just by simplifying things. And so if I can get good information in front of people, I feel like that they can live better lives. And I think it comes down to, like, I grew up in a really small town, and like no one had money. Like, my entire community, there was just no one that had any money. And then sort of as my career progressed, and, you know, I ended up here in beautiful Sydney. And I mean, at one stage when I had my financial planning business, I literally, you know, 30 floors up in Martin Place, right? It was that sort of where I'd come from to where I was at the time was so stark that I have this innate desire for people just to do as well as they possibly can. And it's oftentimes that information and experience doesn't allow people to end up living, you know, their best life, so to speak. And so if I can do my job in helping get information in a more succinct and easy to understand way into the minds of as many people as possible, so that they have the tools to do better in their life, to me, that's such a huge reason to exist. And that's my purpose. Yeah.
That's awesome, Clayton. And you know, you're doing an awesome job with the XY network and sharing the knowledge from, you know, around the advisory industry, so that advisors can then go on to help their clients.
Yeah.
So, you know, you're doing a great job of that. And thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. Hopefully the knowledge that you've shared and the discussion that we've shared will help the listeners to, you know, get to where they want to get to and think about how they want to achieve the things that are most important to them. So once again, thanks very much, and look forward to seeing you very soon.
Mate, thank you very much for hosting me.
Awesome. Thank you for listening to this episode. Our aim is to share the knowledge with as many people as possible, so please share it with everyone you know. And if you're enjoying the show, please subscribe and visit our website, richwithpurpose.com.au, to get access to all our free resources. See you next time.